So, Alan, as we know, we can hear you. Over to you, and I'll start the clock now.
Thank you, and thanks for inviting Owen and myself here. Hopefully, Owen will be able to find the unmute. So our topic is regarding child labor, and it's a very complex situation. And what we're looking at is child labor issues in the developed world, especially the massive increase in child labor in the USA over the past few years, and why that's happening, and also child labor in the developing world and why we're having difficulty dealing with the issue internationally, um, largely because of misunderstandings of what it's all about in the Western world. So some key indicators that children are often forced to work, usually through economic circumstances. Their family cannot afford for the child not to be working. Often it's in conditions that are potentially harmful, and this obviously will interfere with their education, but I'll come back to that in a minute. So child labor has been banned in the US under the Fair Labor Standards, but one of the problems is it doesn't really deal with agriculture, which is one of the main areas of US child labor. There we go.
Alan, can you hear me now?
We can hear you, Owen. Thank you. Do you
Okay.
want to take over?
Yeah, let me start off. I'm sorry for the snafu. I'm on two devices. Well, going back to the first slide, if we could go back to the first slide, slide number 2, Alan. Yeah. And as Alan spoke, he spoke about the fact that we are doing this presentation on child labor in a national, the American perspective, of course, the Canadian perspective, and also an international perspective. And when we talk about child labor, the International Labor Organization defines child labor as work that deprives children of their childhood, their potential, and their dignity, and that is harmful to their physical and mental development. The second slide, Alan, please. Or what would be slide number 3? So Alan and I have been talking about this for a long time now, and some of the key indicators of child labor is that when we talk about child labor, usually force is usually involved. And secondly, usually these young people are being exploited because many of them are not fully aware of their rights, understanding that in the world, the rights of children vary from place to place, but in the United States, it's very specific. And lastly, it interferes with their educational development. Go to slide number 4, which, thank you, Alan. When we talk about the United States, the Fair Labor Standard Act set the minimum age for employment. It restricts the hours young people can work if they're under 16 and prohibit young people under the age of 18 from being employed in hazardous occupation. The next slide, Alan. And the Fair Standard Act, the Fair Labor Standard Act was enacted in 1938. And it was meant to ensure that when young people work, the work is safe and does not jeopardize their health, well-being, or educational opportunities. The next slide, Alan. I know this is a lightning round, right? So in states like Iowa, Missouri, Ohio, and Arkansas, newly passed or pending laws allow companies to hire children without work permit and allow children to work longer hours under more dangerous conditions in places like construction site, meat packing plants, and automobile factory. And we go to my last slide, and then Alan, you take over. So if you look at this slide, you can see that the use of child labor or violation have been on the decline since around 2000. But in 2015, after years of decline, according to the Department of Labor, the total number of violations is much lower than it was 2 decades ago, but it's began to go back up. For example, in 2022, more than 100 kids across several McDonald's locations in Pennsylvania were illegally scheduled to work too many hours or too late at night. And it's not only McDonald's, but also Subways, Burger King, Popeye, and so on and so forth. And we find that, according to the Department of Labor, these violations are increasing. Alan, you could take it over.
Thank you. So the big issue, the way we see it, is that the West really misunderstands the issues of child labor. So the first is, we see this picture of children in the workforce. The question is, when they are removed, what happens? And the usual answer that I've lived in Cambodia and studied, done a lot of work in Southeast Asia. When the child is removed from a job like this, which is quite safe, they end up in places like brick factories. They end up in places, in problem type labor, drug dealing, prostitution, etc. And the reason is that, contrary to the Western understanding, the kid is not working because he wants to buy a Game Boy. The kid is working because the family needs the money from that child's labor to put food on the table. So there's no simple solution of get the child out of work, and they'll go to school. So the question becomes, what is the driver of child labor? Often business is not usually seen as a driver. Is it a driver in the US and other developed states, such as UK, France, and Germany? What we're seeing is, after COVID, there's been a dramatic increase in the need for workers generally, resulting in children now working much more than they ever did. And we see, as Owen said, that in the United States, massive increase, largely because of the lack of people to fill jobs, and the children are often cheap. And we're seeing this across the world, that cheap labor is the competitive advantage for most countries. So the US is late, I think, in coming to the party and realizing if they put children into the workforce, their costs are going to go down. And US industry will be more able to compete with the Europeans, with the Asians. So the question that comes up is this a Western imperialist ideal that children should not work? In poor countries, they have to rely on children to survive. Stop them and the family stops surviving. There are also family systems for children to work on farms or workshops. And that's also the case in Canada, where in Saskatchewan and Quebec, massive amounts of child labor on the farms. And when the government of Saskatchewan tried to stop it, they were met with protest by the farmers saying, this is our way of life. And we're seeing the same issue throughout Africa and Asia, that the children working on the farms is part of the family system. So perhaps to some extent we are in the West trying to impose Western ideals, on them. Now, these are very complex systems, and that is part of the stumbling block. Everybody wants simple answers to complex questions. So firstly, law. We have lots of law. The International Labor Organization has conventions on child labor, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, etc. But the law can help, but it's a very blunt instrument. What we need is economists, sociologists, NGOs, international organizations to get involved. The key to this is poverty is the driving force usually for child labor. That's usually within the realm of government action. Governments can do most to reduce poverty in the country. They can also provide schools to the poor. A big problem in many countries is if the child doesn't work, there are no schools for the poor in these countries for various political reasons. So in many countries, the government does not want to see an educated poor class because that is a recipe for disaster for the government in power. So we're looking at what business can do, and it can be a catalyst to solve the problems, but it cannot solve the problems. Yet we see so much literature being produced that puts all the blame on businesses. As long as we keep doing that, we can't fix the problem. That's the issue, right? They've got to work with NGOs, IOs, chambers of commerce, etc., to try to solve these problems. And to date, most of the pressure being put on businesses is one of the reasons why child labor is increasing. Now, our group, it's a group of 20 lawyers specializing in human rights and business around the globe. We have lawyers from every continent working on this charter on child labor for business, and it's going to be released in the next week or so. So what we're trying to do is look at, firstly, the root causes of child labor and address the human rights violations of child labor, but in a holistic way, not putting all the blame and obligation on businesses, but on governments, etc. We want to ensure that we end child labor by taking the best interests of the child into account. In other words, it's not the best interest of the child for them not to work and not go to school. They have absolutely nothing. So we're trying to have children enjoy their rights, such as education and livelihood, but in a way that will understand the realities rather than just putting out these positions that don't work. Recently, there's a paper done by the University of Geneva, and they studied child labor in the cocoa farms in Africa. And the bottom line from their research was businesses often make it worse by trying to deal with the problems on a one-on-one basis. It can't be done. When when business acts, it just moves the child labor from one area to another. So in our charter, we're trying to provide a system so that when the companies want to help with child labor, they know who to turn to get advice in the particular country, in the particular area in the country, so that they can all work together to reduce and remove child labor. The UN, with their guidelines, has said they want to remove child labor by 2025. Well, that's just a few months away. That's not happening. And the reason from our perspective is the right formula is not being used. We're putting the pressure on business rather than governments and others. So that concludes my presentation. I look forward to questions from the audience.